So we've been following through the chapters of the book of Ruth. And this third chapter leads us to the threshing room floor. We heard initially from Orpah telling her story, then we heard last week from Ruth, and this week we're going to hear a little bit from Naomi about what the threshing room floor means to her. But this chapter is filled with double entendre. It's risque in nature. Later on in the biblical story, the threshing floor becomes associated with prostitution. So maybe you want to avert your eyes or skip to the next chapter. But the threshing floor, as murky as the morality in the situation was, or at least has the potential to be, it's still a very important part of the unfolding story. The other problem with the threshing room floor is that it runs us up against unfamiliar customs which jar our modern senses and obscure what's going on. Instead of governments or organizations who look after the poor, in my day, God's people were told to look after one another. So when one person in the family suffered, the rest of the family would step up and provide shelter and relationship. A kinsman redeemer served the purpose of a social safety net. And so, because Elimelech, my husband, had died, it was the extended family's responsibility to look after the rest of us, which at the time included me, and now it also included Ruth, who I'd brought from Moab. The other unfamiliar custom to you likely is marriage. Now, I know that you get married in your day, but marriage customs when I lived were a little bit different. Hint, marriage was not about romance when I lived. Marriage in my world was an alliance of families, and we would provide important benefits for one another, including social, economic, and political advantages, and of course, the possibility of having children. In addition to that, there was a custom, which again was a little bit of a social safety net, but it's very strange when you hear it to you, but it's known as levirate marriage. So this is where if a man died and left his widow with no sons, then in order to protect the heritage of the family, the brother-in-law would marry her. And any sons that she had after that would be counted to the dead husband's name. And you likely know that the situation of Ruth and I, we were two widows left alone without husband or sons. We were completely alone in the world together. We were trying to make our way in what really in the end was a man's world. So all of those things were in my mind when I made my plan for the threshing floor. And it was a wild plan, and it was full of risk. It was almost like the flip of a coin. It was a massive gamble. So why would I take that chance and offer up the person who is God's gift to me? Well, scarcity had defined my life for as long as I can remember. Sure, I have a few memories from my earliest days where that wasn't the case, a few good days in the meantime that glimmered among the string of the bad. But most of my adult life was marked by famine, hunger, grief, and loss. And at this point in the story, there were signs that things were finally beginning to change. Maybe I was rounding a corner. The Lord had finally sent rain, and there was food again in Bethlehem. But it was hard to trust this hope at first. Anyone who deals with agriculture could tell you that farming can be cruel, and you always keep your eyes on the skies. In everyone's not-so-distant memory, there were no crops to harvest. And so the very fact that there was even a harvest, when we had gotten to the point where we could winnow our grain and count the piles of it and put it into storehouses, that was a cause for a party. It was time to celebrate the Lord's goodness to us. I think that probably this celebration that we were preparing for might have been a little bit like your Thanksgiving and your Christmas and your New Year's celebrations all rolled into one. Everyone living in Bethlehem was so thankful there was finally a harvest to celebrate, that at that time there would be food and feasting, sweet things to eat and drinks flowing. It was going to be a great party. And just like the scarcity that I had been living with for so long had begun to ease as the rain and harvest returned to Bethlehem, my loneliness began to ease as well. Now, I didn't have the eyes to see it at first. They were clouded with grief, but Ruth had clung to me on the road to Bethlehem. Ruth refused to leave my side when I left Moab. And all summer, she had been nothing but a gift. In order to keep food on our table, she took up the practice of gleaning. She would go into the fields and go behind the harvest workers and gather whatever was left over from the harvests. And Ruth was seemingly tireless in her work. And between her efficiency and her boldness, and with the generosity of a near relative of my late husband's family named Boaz, who had shown Ruth kindness and allowed her to glean in his fields exclusively, we got through that first summer in Bethlehem. Make no mistake, though, even though Boaz had given Ruth every advantage when she worked in his fields, gleaning was hard work. Ruth was at the mercy of the elements every single day, and she worked long hours, bending and gathering, hauling and threshing. And she would bring me everything she gathered. And we would eat for another day, sometimes two, and God provided enough for each and every day. But we certainly didn't have an abundance of food. And although I tried to conceal it from Ruth, the moment she left our door in the morning till the moment I heard her returning, I just couldn't relax. And no matter how much Ruth brought home, no matter how hard she worked, even with the goodness of Boaz, it didn't erase the pain of the past. You see, the truth about grief, as I am learning, is that you never really get over it. Yes, you keep going. Yes, you continue living, but grief is always a part of your story. And so even though I had begun to revive here in Bethlehem, very slowly with the simple joy of having someone bring home food and having Ruth spend my evenings with me and share in the chores, I was beginning to get better. And even my faith was beginning to rebound. It was taking root and growing once again. But this joy still existed alongside the pain of the past. But Ruth and I as a team, we'd managed to eke out an existence, and we found goodness and joy and blessing where we could. And we lived through the barley harvest and then through the harvest of wheat. And Boaz had been as good as his word. By his graciousness, Ruth was able to take home enough that we were prevented from experiencing the worst ravages of poverty. And it was way more than I had hoped for when I'd first started out for Bethlehem. But I also knew that this couldn't go on forever. Now, Boaz was our near relative, and it was in his power to save my family line and to look after me, perhaps even Ruth as well, in a more permanent way. But all throughout the summer, he had made no move to do so. Of course, he was more than kind in dealing with Ruth in the fields, and for a time that was enough. We managed through the summer. But with this harvest party approaching, the party that was going to celebrate God's goodness to us that came from this harvest, even as I wanted to celebrate, some of that old and familiar anxiety began to visit me again. And I thought, what is going to happen to us next? We had a little bit of grain put away because of Boaz's kindness when he allowed Ruth to glean generously. But would our meager stores of grain last throughout the winter when there was no harvest? What would we do when the skies turned rainy and the weather cool? Now, I wasn't all that worried for myself. After the life I had, I thought, well, I'll probably be okay. God has always given me at least enough for today, and then the next day, and then the next. And honestly, I'm not that afraid to trade in this life for the next one. But I was worried about Ruth. What would the next chapter be for her? And so as the harvest party drew near, the wheels in my head began to turn, and the outline of a plan began to form. Sometimes when we look back on the events of our lives, it feels like certain things are inevitable. But in my story, I don't think that anything much happened by chance. the story of how my emptiness was beginning to ease. It was all entirely dependent on the choices that other people had made. Ruth, as I've said, was God's gift to me, but she made a personal, free choice when she refused to leave my side. She defied logic. She even went against my own instructions in order to look after me. And with Boaz, it was the same. He had demonstrated kindness as well, but there was nobody making him act kindly to us either. And even though life in this world can be messy and difficult, we all have choices we can make. We can choose to bless or to hurt. We can choose to be selfish, or we can act in love toward those around us. We can choose to act as God might act, or we can choose our own self-interest. And now I realized I needed to make a choice. I could certainly keep Ruth by my side to keep me company, to help me provide, but I could also help Ruth find a future. And it would certainly be better than the existence on the margins that had been our reality throughout the entire summer. I too could show love by letting Ruth go. And this was the chance I saw to do just that. So I spoke to Ruth one day and I said, "My dear daughter, isn't it about time I arranged a home for you so that you can have a happy life? And isn't Boaz our close relative? The one with whose young women you've been working? Maybe it's time for us to make our move," I said. And it was a risky move. If it went wrong, Ruth might lose even the meager community that she had gained, the right to glean richly from the land of a good man. And if Ruth was turned away, we might lose the only thing that had been keeping us afloat for so long. Not only that, I knew that this could put Ruth in a potentially compromising situation. I told her to wait until Boaz was in high spirits, having had lots to eat and to drink, and I told her to watch where he would lie down. And then under cover of darkness, I told her to slip under the covers with him. Now, from what I knew about Boaz, I knew he was an honorable man. That's why I urged Ruth to take this risk. And then I told her once she'd done all of this, Boaz would take it from there. And for once, Ruth didn't argue back. Instead, she just did what I asked her to do. She took off the garments of a widow in mourning, and she dressed up in fine clothing, hoping that Boaz would get the hint. She's no longer in mourning for her husband, so she's available for marriage once again. And she went off that night, and as she went, I prayed in earnest. I prayed as much as I have prayed in a very long time, that God would be good to Ruth, just as God had done so far in Bethlehem, and that maybe our risky plan would pay off. Maybe Ruth would finally have the hope and the future she deserved. And when I prayed, I tried to keep in mind who is the real hero of our story. While Ruth and I were always trying to sort out what is right and best in our world and in our lives, our understanding is always limited. We are only human. And the real hero of this story, it was not Ruth, as wonderful as she is, and it was not Boaz, as kind as he is, and it certainly isn't me. And this is not, as you may have heard, at its core, a story about romance or about courtship. This is a story about God. And this is a story about how God works in the hearts and lives of those who love God. And this chapter in the story is no different. But I wonder, does the intimacy of the proposition I told Ruth to make, the risk of impropriety, the chance that this situation could turn quickly and get out of hand, and that if it did, that Ruth would pay the price? Or if everything goes according as we planned it, and both Ruth and Boaz conducted themselves uprightly, but the possibility of wagging tongues could ruin her reputation in Bethlehem forever. Does this make you want to look away? Does it make us uncomfortable? Perhaps you think less of me for sending my dear daughter-in-law, one of my closest friends in the world, into that situation. because I knew better than anyone that if the gamble that Boaz was a good man and that Yahweh would look after Ruth out there at night on the threshing floor in the middle of a raging party, if that plan didn't work out, the consequences could be devastating. And if there'd been a lot of other choices that we had, this certainly would not have been the path that I would have taken. But then again, isn't that just sometimes the way it is in our everyday, real lives? People who love Yahweh are sometimes in murky and difficult situations where none of the choices are easy to make. And the life that we have to live is not an ideal life that we would dream of, but it's the one we have. Like my ancestor Tamar, who had to make difficult choices in order to see that justice was done. Or like someone who comes on the scene much later, who I didn't know, but who you might, Mary, who bore Jesus. Sometimes our situations are unconventional. Sometimes they're difficult. And no matter what people might say about us in the process, we have to live through them anyway. Now, I had not slept a wink worrying about Ruth that night, but I knew I had to let her go all the same. Just as Ruth had poured herself out for me, I was willing to pour myself out for her and release the one good thing in my life. And my churning stomach didn't calm down until the next morning when I saw Ruth making her way back to our home. And then she told me everything she had done. Our gamble had paid off. Boaz was indeed an upright person, and God had looked after Ruth. But Ruth once again knocked my socks off when she described what had happened. Now, I had already realized after living with her for so long that she was a brave woman, and she often got right to the point. She took charge when she first suggested that she might go out and glean for our meals. And when she arrived at the stranger's field on that first day, she wasted no time going to the foreman with her request to glean right behind the harvesters, even though it was against custom what she was asking to do. And now she'd done it again. She told me how she found Boaz on the threshing floor after he'd gone to sleep and slipped in beside him. That was all as I told her to do. And then he'd startled awake. And when he asked her, "Who are you?" I had said to her, well, he's going to take it from there. But instead, Ruth took charge. She answered him, "I am Ruth, your maiden." She said, "Take me under your protecting wing. You're my close relative, you know. In the circle of covenant redeemers, you do have the right to marry me." Now, I know this statement might not make a lot of sense to you, but what Ruth did that night on the threshing room floor was propose marriage to Boaz. And she chose her words very carefully. See, when Ruth first met Boaz, he said to her this, "God will reward you well for what you've done, and with a generous bonus beside from God, to whom you've come seeking protection under his wings." Keep that word in your mind, wings. Just like a bird protects her chicks under her wings, Boaz said to Ruth that the great wings of God's protection would be extended to Ruth, who was a poor woman from another country in a dire situation. God would not forget to protect her, Boaz said. And when he acted on Ruth's behalf, one of the things it showed us is how God is on the side of people like us, those who are desperate and who existed on the margins. Boaz had been a source of protection for Ruth and for me. He'd been the face of God when he cared for us in a world that was mostly indifferent to people like us. But now Ruth had outright asked him to go further than that. And she insisted that he spread his wing over her. So that's the same word he used when he spoke to her before. Boaz, if he was willing, could be the source of divine intervention for our family. And Ruth had spoken quite boldly, not wanting to leave what might happen to chance. She broke all the rules of etiquette. She outright asked Boaz to fulfill his duty to Elimelech. She told him to save my family. And Ruth had come back to me with another huge load of grain that Boaz had given her. And he had insisted to her that she leave very early in the morning before anyone might see her and get the wrong idea in their head of what has gone on. And while my gamble on the character of Boaz and the protection of God had paid off, the matter was not quite as settled as I had hoped. There was a wrench in my plan. You see, for a long time we had wondered why Boaz had not already approached us with some kind of offer, that we might have a better, more hopeful existence than just living off the gleanings that Ruth made. In fact, over the centuries, some people who have read this story have pointed out just that. As kind as Boaz was, he could have done more. And he could have done it without Ruth and I having to devise such a risky gamble in order to ask him to do what was right. But perhaps part of the answer as to why he hadn't done anything yet lied in this. Boaz told Ruth there was another relative closer to our family than he was, and it was actually that man's duty to provide for us, though he had made no move to do that either. But Boaz said if that man would refuse, that he himself would do what Ruth had brazenly asked him to do. And he also promised her that he would get the matter sorted out, and quite soon. And I, for one, took him at his word. I trusted Boaz to do as he promised to Ruth, and I told her that. I said, sit back and relax, my dear, until we find out how things turn out. That man isn't going to fool around. Mark my words, he's going to get everything wrapped up today. And so now you will have to wait to find out what will happen, but you won't have to wait long. Next week, you'll see how the rest of the story plays out. Would you bow with me in a word of prayer? God of love and faithfulness, we thank you for how much you love us. We thank you that you show the ins and outs of your love to us in our daily lives. We thank you for all the ways you provide for us. Help us to have eyes to see the ways you show your love, especially the way you demonstrate your love through other people. And help us also to show your love and care and faithfulness to others and become the face of God to them as well. Amen. As you go this week, remember that by the goodness of God you were born. In the mercy of Jesus Christ you have been redeemed. That God walks with you every day to comfort, strengthen, and guide you. Just as Jesus promised, behold, I am with you always. Remember that while others have called you servant, Jesus has called you friend. And in the strength of that mighty friendship, go into this week and serve in the name of Jesus until we meet again. Amen. Go in peace.